Thanks, David. I've spent a lot of time in India, so I know that 8 minutes here is about 20 minutes elsewhere, but you can, you can try and abbreviate me, that's fine. So my paper is called Nutrition-Sensitive Economic Growth. I've changed the title a couple of times. My initial title was Pro-Nutrition Growth, but then I discovered that there was this phrase in the literature called nutrition-sensitive, which kind of means the same thing. I should add that I'm pretty fortunate, even if I do run out of time, there's a policy brief that should be in all your bags that's related to this paper, and there's also the background paper for this is already on the IFPRI website, and you should be able to download it there pretty easily. So there's two kind of motivations for my paper, or two debates. Obviously there's a wide consensus now that reducing malnutrition is a critical goal. I don't need to tell anyone in the audience here about that. But is there a consensus about how to achieve that goal? So many programs focus on quite nutrition-specific interventions. These could be food supplements or feeding centers or training programs. But non-nutrition processes, quote-unquote, such as income growth, food production, female education, health outcomes, family planning outcomes, these can potentially have very profound effects on nutrition outcomes. Now, I'm sure many nutritionists, well, I know that many nutritionists are aware of this. Others still focus on nutrition-specific programs. But one of the kind of empirical questions I wanted to look at across countries is what's the relative role of nutrition-specific programs versus, if you like, nutrition-sensitive interventions. A second is kind of on the role of economic growth. There's been a long question on the role of income and the role of economic growth in impacting nutrition. There's a lot of literature on the impact of economic growth on poverty reduction, which often shows that agricultural growth is extremely pro-poor. But there's many papers that say things like growth is not enough, growth is not good enough. So that's one of the issues I wanted to touch upon again. If you consider the nature of malnutrition, it's determined by many intermediate factors. If you look at a typical kind of household survey, econometric equation, for example, from the demographic health surveys, you'll first of all see about 20 variables. And then if you actually look at the impact of most of these variables, it's quite small. The same if you look at randomized trials. You'll often find, even when there is a significant effect of an intervention, the actual impact is quite small. And why is that? Well, I mean, if you look at something like the UNICEF framework, which hugely simplifies the ways in which malnutrition is determined, it has proximate causes, intermediate causes, deeper underlying causes, and within that, then a whole huge of things. I know this work we've done on malnutrition in India. You know, when we tried to think about all the determinants of malnutrition in India, it was an almost endless list. So the determination of malnutrition outcomes is very complex. So if you think about economic growth or even institutional change or governance change, these deeper processes can potentially have a very profound effect for precisely that reason. They can reduce poverty, they can reduce fertility, they can improve health and education and even institutions. And of course, in other countries, the opposite may happen. Economic growth could completely bypass the poor, it could be driven by oil revenues, it could not be spent on improving the lives of the poor. So there's likely to be a great deal of variation of the impacts of economic growth across countries. So what's the methods I look at? So basically I do these cross-country regressions. You can look at for more details in the paper. But the key thing you need to note about this, I'm looking at changes over time, not at levels. A lot of the existing research basically looks at levels. And it's, for me at least, it's not very interesting to explain why malnutrition is higher in Africa than it is in the OECD. I've said the opposite there. It should be lower in OECD. So it's not very interesting to explain these things in levels. We know that in the long run, of course, I mean, it's quite, all countries in the world will eventually solve the malnutrition problem. But we're not really interested in the long run. If we're interested in the MDGs and the welfare of current generations, then we want to know what changes malnutrition in the next 10 or 15 years. So, for example, my regressions say, okay, does a change in GDP per capita or the other variables I look at in country X produce a change in stunting over, say, for example, 1998 to 2005. That's just an example of a period in my data set. So I'm only looking at within-country variation over time. And then I'll also look at some particular case studies later. So I look at two types of ways of decomposing economic growth. I look at overall economic growth, but I look at the productive sectors and basically just agricultural and non-agricultural growth. And then in the next few slides, I'll look at the social sectors. So in terms of the productive sectors, as I said, there's a lot of literature showing that agricultural growth is very pro-poor, but is it pro-nutrition? The answer is yes, agriculture does seem to have effects on reducing malnutrition, but it's very conditional, mostly in ways that you would expect. First, the effects depend upon the size of the agricultural sector. So in a country like Djibouti or Singapore, agriculture is not going to matter because it's not an important source of livelihoods and it's not an important means of obtaining food. But in poor countries where agriculture is a dominant livelihood and a dominant part of the economy, it has a big effect. Second, the effects of agricultural growth seem to be related more to food production than, say, cash crop production, and that's not very surprising either. But the effect is much stronger when initial food insecurity is lower. So if you break up countries into food insecure, moderately food insecure, and food secure, you only find effects in the food insecure countries, the lower two groups. And that's also not surprising. I can't elucidate much on what the exact channel is. You may think it's just more food, but you also have to be aware that poor people grow a lot of food too, so there's an important income effect there as well. And I can't really disentangle that across countries, so I can just present that fact. Third, my data set actually pulls together Indian states with other countries. So I treat, if you like, each Indian state as if it were a country. And the interesting thing is these effects only hold outside of India. So there seems to be a disconnect between agricultural growth and malnutrition in India, quite similar to what we saw in this panel session yesterday on the Tackling the Agricultural and Nutrition Disconnect in India, a project that we're running, that IFPRI and others are running here in India. Now, there may be many reasons for that. It'd be interesting to talk about that in the discussion section. There are lots of hypotheses, but I'll move on from that for the moment. These are basically just to show you the size of the effects by running a simulation. So basically I'm saying what's the impact of a 10% increase in agricultural GDP per capita or food production per capita on malnutrition prevalence, and this is stunting prevalence, in a typical poor country. And you can see that the effects are very large. The first bracket shows that when agriculture is about 30% of GDP, a 10% increase in agricultural production per capita reduces stunting by just over 2 percentage points. That's a reasonable return. The second bar there is just a variation of that, just a statistical thing. The third shows what I talked about before, the impacts of increased food production in food insecure countries. And that's really quite a large effect, 3.5 percentage points of reduction you'll see. And the fourth is just another variation of that based on energy supply. I mentioned before that this increase in food production, it's hard to say what the channels are. Is it to do with increasing food consumption, food availability, or is it through income effects? I tried to explore that a little bit. One thing that is an interesting stylized fact, I guess, is that if you think about it, most of the calories consumed in a poor country are domestically produced calories. So, even though countries, some countries import, like for example, a large share of rice, say in West Africa or so on, in most countries the food they eat is domestically produced. So if you can get growth in that sector, you're going to increase basically calorie availability. Agricultural growth is not quite as big a driver of dietary diversity. I looked at changes in dietary diversity too. But actually there you tend to find that dietary diversity obviously changes a little bit more as incomes get higher and is influenced by non-agricultural growth as well. So I'm happy to answer questions about that later on, but this graph is kind of designed to show you that at least at low levels of calorie, agricultural growth is mostly geared towards increasing calorie availability and presumably intake. Okay, what about the social sector? So among the productive sectors, we saw that agriculture seems to be very important. Actually, in the paper I show, it's generally looks more important than non-agricultural growth. But what about the social sectors? I tested a range of factors here, usually mostly based on the Demographic Health Survey's data. And of about the 9 or 10 variables that I looked at, these are the 4 that came out with stunting. These vary a little bit if you look at underweight prevalence, but with stunting, the 4 variables that seem to matter were this DHS poverty index. This is based on the number of households that don't own any assets of the measured assets. Second is medically attended births. I also looked at vaccinations, but that had a slightly weaker relationship. The third is female secondary education, whether a woman had any secondary education. Primary education had no effect. And the fourth is fertility rates. Fertility rates are a proxy for a range of things that are relevant in malnutrition, like the age at marriage, the interval between births, and just the sheer number of children as well. So you can think of that as a proxy for kind of family planning outcomes. I then did 2 more tests. First, I wanted to know, does growth operate through these channels? In other words, does economic growth influence poverty, medical births, female secondary education, and fertility rates? And the second is I wanted to see how much these social factors mattered, say, relative to just general economic growth. So I looked at an index of these 4 factors, just an equally weighted index, and looked at changes over time to see whether this index, if you like, this pro-nutrition index, predicted changes in nutrition. So this just shows the results of my statistical test. It's the impact of a doubling of GDP per capita on these 4 socioeconomic channels. All these indicators are measured as prevalence. So this is female secondary education. So if you double income per capita, you can normally expect secondary female education to increase by about 14 percentage points. I've got an arrow there because female education has a strong effect on fertility rates. So if you increase income, part of the effect on fertility is via female secondary education. There's a strong effect there. There's an even stronger effect on medically attended births, 18 percentage points. And somewhat surprisingly, the effect on asset poverty is not that strong, although that may be related to how I've measured asset poverty. It's a measure of extreme poverty rather than, even $2 a day poverty, $1 a day poverty. So that answers the first question. Economic growth does work through these channels, at least regularly. There's going to be a lot of variation around the mean, but regularly it does that.
Eric, you're up to 10 minutes.
I'm up to 10. Okay, I can sum up pretty quick. This is the third last slide, maybe. This graph just shows, okay, I wanted to ask the second question, does this pro-nutrition development have more of an effect on malnutrition, stunting, than just normal economic growth? And this result basically shows it does. Again, it's a 10% increase in GDP or a 10% increase in this nutrition index. And you'll see that the nutrition index typically reduces stunting by almost 3 percentage points, which is a pretty good return. The last thing I do is just to, rather than just report these cross-country regressions, I looked at success stories. In the paper, I look at actually maybe about 30 success stories, what I call proven and unproven success stories, and also a bunch of failures. But here I'll just focus on a few countries to illustrate a point. One of the groups of successes are what I call long-term successes with well-documented nutrition programs. Honduras is perhaps the only exception here. It's a relatively short time period, but it has a well-known nutrition program. And the first 2 columns just show the annual change in underweight prevalence or stunting prevalence. And you'll see that's quite rapid in all these countries, much higher than the overall mean. Thailand is by far the most successful country. Bangladesh is a particularly interesting success I'll talk about in a second. And then on the next few columns, I just looked to see whether these countries had trends that were consistent with my cross-country results. So were there dietary improvements? Actually, yes, in all cases except Mexico, although dietary improvements need to be taken with a grain of salt. I could discuss that more. Was there rapid economic growth, greater than 5%? And then in brackets, was there agricultural growth? And what's interesting there is that there was rapid economic growth in all the low-income countries. But in the middle-income countries, Brazil, Honduras, Mexico, there wasn't rapid economic growth. For example, Brazil was actually a period of very poor economic growth, economic decline. But these middle-income countries seemingly were able to fund pro-nutrition programs because they already had a reasonable level of economic wealth. And then was there favourable health, education, and fertility trends? And as it happens, yes, in all the countries. I mean, quite strong. And that's interesting because, as I said, these countries all have nutrition-specific programs, but there was obviously a lot going on in the background. I think Bangladesh is a particularly interesting example because the BIMP program there was not very favourably reviewed by the World Bank, but there's so much going on in the background. There's lots of NGOs, including BRAC in Bangladesh, but there are also reasonable increases in income, rural infrastructure, and a very strong decline in fertility. So in all these countries, there's a lot going on in the background. I can touch upon these later. I also look at 6 Green Revolution countries, 15 unproven successes from recent years, and some very puzzling failures such as Egypt, Kazakhstan, and in India, Gujarat. And there are also successes that were not sustained, particularly several Indian states, and then there were failures that reversed themselves, countries that did very badly and then turned things around. So there's a lot of potential cross-country learning. Just a summary of main points. Basically, nutrition-sensitive growth involves increased food production, especially in poor countries. poverty reduction, improvements in health access, female education, and better family planning, and maybe others too. Infrastructure doesn't turn up in my results, but that may be particularly important in some countries. The successes show that sustaining malnutrition improvements in poor countries seems to require economic growth, but failures also show that that's sometimes not specific. I mean, there are examples like Gujarat in India and Egypt elsewhere where there's pretty strong economic growth and even some seemingly pro-poor interventions, but no change in malnutrition. And also there's many proven successes, but there's also many emerging successes that among my emerging successes are Ghana, which we're going to hear about soon, but many others that deserve more research. Thank you.
Thank you very much.